Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, December 18th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Israeli defense minister says Israel to occupy Gaza indefinitely. So Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz said Tuesday that the Israeli military will occupy Gaza like it does the West Bank even after the genocidal war in the Strip comes to an end. So Katz wrote on X, quote, "After we defeat Hamas's military and governmental power in Gaza, Israel will have security control over Gaza with full freedom of action, just as it did in Judea and Samaria," end quote. And he's using the biblical name there for the West Bank. So this is something, it's very clear that this is Israel's goal, is to maintain an occupation of Gaza. But here is the Israeli defense minister coming out right and saying that he differs from his predecessor, Yoav Gallant, who, as bad as he was, he would say that the Israeli military could not stay in Gaza indefinitely. And Katz's comments come amid these reports that Israel and Hamas are close to a hostage deal that would involve a temporary ceasefire. Although on Tuesday, there's a report from Axios citing Israeli officials that said significant gaps remain and that an agreement is not imminent despite optimistic statements. So that's throwing cold water on these reports of a chance of a hostage deal here. But you see Katz's comments, and he said in his tweet that it was a response to reports. And I think he was referencing these reports about a hostage deal. And if you remember during the last time there was like a real chance at a deal, Netanyahu sabotaged it by coming out with these kind of declarations. He kept saying that, they're not going to end the war, even though Hamas's main demand was, a permanent ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal. So they'd be negotiating behind the scenes, and then Netanyahu would come out and say something like, "Oh, we're not gonna end the war until Hamas is destroyed." Or then he started demanding control of the Philadelphia corridor and everything. So I suspect that Katz might be doing something similar here with what he's saying, because the reports say that Hamas conceded that it won't ask for an Israeli withdrawal right away during the ceasefire, but then you have Hamas officials saying that their proposal involves a gradual ceasefire and withdrawal. It's probably something like, there won't be a withdrawal during the initial ceasefire, but then they're going to enter negotiations, and they want to guarantee that Israel will negotiate to permanently end things. And then here you have Katz saying this. And there was another report in Israeli media that said Israel plans to keep troops in place in Gaza to prevent displaced Palestinians from returning to northern Gaza, where the IDF has been carrying out this ethnic cleansing campaign known as the General's Plan. And I read, it's tough. I'm referencing all these different reports. I'm trying to piece things together. It's tough to really know what's going on behind the scenes in the negotiations. I haven't spent too much time covering the negotiations over the past few months for that reason, and it just did not seem like there was any chance of a deal. But lately, there's been public statements from both sides saying that a deal was close, but now some cold water has been thrown on that. But again, based on some of these reports, it looks like one of the impasses is that Hamas wants Palestinians to be able to return to northern Gaza, and we know Israel's not going to let that happen because they're carrying out a campaign to cleanse northern Gaza of all of the Palestinians that live there. And of course, this is to make way for Jewish settlements. That's the ultimate goal here. Whether, Netanyahu doesn't say that explicitly, but many members of the Israeli government and the Israeli Knesset are open about their support for settlements and completely ethnically cleansing Gaza of its Palestinian population. All right, so the next one here, Israeli attacks kill at least 31 Palestinians over 24 hours. So Gaza's health ministry said Tuesday that Israeli attacks across the Strip killed at least 31 Palestinians and wounded 79 over the previous 24-hour period. And again, that's based on the number of dead and wounded Palestinians who arrived at hospitals in that 24-hour period. Reuters reported that Israeli strikes on 2 separate areas of northern Gaza on Tuesday killed extended families in their homes. Palestinian medics said that at least 10 were killed by an attack on a home in a suburb of Gaza City. You see a picture here. This is in Gaza City, a funeral for what looks like a child that was killed by Israeli airstrikes. Every day we see children killed and maimed. In Beit Lahia, which has been under a total siege since early October, at least 15 people were believed to be killed or are missing under the rubble after an Israeli airstrike, and rescuers were unable to access the site due to the siege on the city. The medics told Reuters that at least 10 other Palestinians were killed by Israeli attacks in other parts of Beit Lahia and Gaza City. The Kamal Adwan Hospital in Beit Lahia also said it's come under attack again. The hospital's come under a whole bunch of Israeli attacks recently. Just a really horrific situation for the Palestinians there. I believe there's only a few thousand left in Beit Lahia. And in these cities, Israel, they're going through with bulldozers and just demolishing everything, so they have nowhere to return to. In southern Gaza, Israeli tanks entered the Mawasi camp, which is a so-called safe zone that Israeli forces have repeatedly attacked despite declaring it a humanitarian zone. And IDF soldiers forcibly displaced Palestinians in the camp and blew up several houses and burned down tents. So just the daily violence, the daily slaughter continues. I'm trying to look for some optimism here. We saw those reports yesterday about a ceasefire deal being close, but now it just, realistically, I don't think a ceasefire deal is going to happen in these next few weeks, but I hope something's got to give here. This needs to stop. People need a relief from this. And even if it's a bad deal where there's a temporary ceasefire, there's got to be something here because there's just no end in sight. All right, so the next one here, Palestinians sue the State Department over U.S. assistance to Israel's military. This article's from Al Jazeera. So 5 Palestinians in Gaza, the occupied West Bank, and the United States are suing the U.S. government to try to cut off American assistance to the Israeli military over its involvement in serious human rights abuses. The lawsuit, announced on Tuesday, accuses the Department of State of failing to implement a federal law that prohibits the transfer of funds to foreign military units engaged in gross violations such as extrajudicial killings and torture. The lawsuit reads, quote, "The State Department's calculated failure to apply the Leahy Law is particularly shocking in the face of the unprecedented escalation of Israeli gross human rights violations since the Gaza war erupted on October 7th, 2023, end quote. Israel's bombardment and ground operations in Gaza have killed more than 45,000 Palestinians. The UN and the world's leading rights groups have accused the Israeli military of carrying out war crimes, including genocide. And the lead plaintiff in this case against the State Department is a Gaza teacher referred to by the pseudonym Amal Gaza. And that teacher has been forcibly displaced 7 times since the war began, and 20 of her family members have been killed in Israeli attacks. She said in a statement, quote, "My suffering and the unimaginable loss of my family has endured would be significantly lessened if the U.S. stopped providing military assistance to Israeli units committing gross violations of human rights," end quote. Contacted by Al Jazeera for comment, the State Department said that it does not comment on pending litigation. Some background here on the Leahy Law. So the U.S. is actually in violation of multiple foreign assistance laws. There's foreign assistance laws that prohibit aid to countries that block humanitarian aid deliveries, which Israel is doing, prohibit aid to countries committing human rights violations, which is the Leahy laws. There's also a foreign assistance law that prohibits military aid to countries that have nuclear weapons and don't sign the non-proliferation treaty. The U.S. is in violation of that by arming Israel, although the U.S. does not officially recognize Israel's nuclear weapons stockpile. But, it's just, there's all these exceptions for Israel here, and they're just ignoring all this evidence of war crimes to continue funding Israel and giving them whatever they want. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu visits Israeli-occupied Mount Hermon. So on Tuesday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited Israeli troops on top of Syria's Mount Hermon, located on the Syria-Lebanon border, and said Israel would continue occupying Syrian territory it captured following the regime change in Damascus until another arrangement can be found. Those were his words, until another arrangement can be found. Netanyahu said that he hadn't been to Mount Hermon since being involved in a military patrol in the area 53 years ago. He said, quote, "This place hasn't changed. It's the same place, but it's important to Israel's security has only been reinforced in recent years, and especially in recent weeks with the dramatic events taking place below us here in Syria," end quote. Netanyahu was joined by other Israeli officials, including Defense Minister Israel Katz, who said Israeli troops would occupy Mount Hermon for as long as needed. See a picture here of all the Israeli officials and Israeli troops. Katz said, quote, "Our presence here at the peak of the Hermon strengthens security and adds a dimension of both observation and deterrence to Hezbollah's strongholds in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, and deterrence against the rebels in Damascus who pretend to present a moderate image but belong to the most extreme Islamic sects," end quote. So it's interesting to hear Katz say that, because essentially what's happening here is Israel wanted the regime change in Syria. They, their airstrikes, their air campaign against Syria, against Hezbollah, played a big role in weakening the Syrian government, which led to its collapse. Netanyahu took credit for the regime change. He celebrated it. He said it was, a blow to the Iranian axis. And because the big thing that is happening as a result of this is that the weapon shipments, the weapon supply from Syria to Hezbollah is going to dry up. But at the same time, now they're using the HTS, the Al-Qaeda link group that took over, as the excuse to take Syrian territory, to go into Syria. And they've bombed Syria hundreds of times. We're seeing this both from the U.S. and Israel, because the U.S. is justifying Israel's actions. They're like, yeah, Assad is out. It's good. We're going to work with these guys. HTS. This is what the U.S. is saying. Even though they're a terror designated foreign terrorist organization. But then when asked about what Israel's doing, they say, there's terrorist groups in Syria. It's like, just the double standard here, is just too much sometimes. But you see this map from South Front. There's reports that Israeli forces were capturing more villages in southern Syria on Tuesday. So these Israeli troops are not going anywhere anytime soon, and they're making that very clear. All right, so the next one here, Julani says Syria will not be used as a launch pad to attack Israel. So the leader of the Al-Qaeda offshoot Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is leading Syria following the regime change that ousted Bashar al-Assad, has said Syria would not become a launch pad to attack Israel. So this is Abu Muhammad al-Julani. He did a sit-down interview with the London Times, and said, quote, "We do not want any conflict, whether with Israel or anyone else, and we will not let Syria be used as a launch pad for attacks," end quote. So Julani, he's been going by his real name, Ahmad al-Shara, he called for Israel to withdraw from Syria and respect the 1974 ceasefire agreement that established the buffer zone between the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights and the rest of Syria. Julani said, quote, "We are committed to the 1974 agreement and we are prepared to return the UN monitors," end quote. So under that agreement, UN peacekeeping forces patrol that buffer zone. Julani, taking kind of a deferential tone toward Israel, even though Israel's been bombing Syria. I mean, they say over 800 times that they've bombed Syria, and massive strikes the other night causing an earthquake. All right, so the next one here, Israel continues to flaunt Lebanon ceasefire, demolishes homes. This article is from Jason Ditz. Now into the third week of the Israeli ceasefire with Lebanon, the situation seems no more settled than it had been. Israeli forces continue to operate across southern Lebanon. Their drones carry out attacks, and Israeli military bulldozers are now conducting operations to demolish civilian homes in southern towns and villages. The 60-day ceasefire is supposed to see Israel withdraw its troops from Lebanon by the end of that time. Though some Israeli troops have been redeployed, others remain and are continuing operations. The reports from the coastal town of Nakora are that Israeli troops have fired bursts of machine gun fire, and the bulldozers have destroyed multiple homes. And there's been other demolitions of homes in another village, and there's been other Israeli airstrikes. There was a drone attack on a car in Majdal Zun in southern Lebanon. Multiple people were reported wounded, so Israel continues to bomb Syria, is demolishing homes. There's a report from Al Jazeera about all the white phosphorus that Israel has used in Lebanon. They've used it around 200 times in the south on these populated villages, white phosphorus. Technically, under international law, it's legal to use as a smoke screen or as a marker. But if you use it in an area where there's civilians or where there's people, not even just civilians, then it's considered an illegal chemical weapon. It can burn skin to the bone, and Israel has used this quite a bit in Lebanon. But so they continue. The ceasefire has basically been only one side has ceased firing, and Israel has just been bombing Lebanon with impunity here. All right, so the next one here, Turkey masses troops on Syria border. This is another one from Jason. So there's been reports that this ceasefire, the State Department said that there's a ceasefire between the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army and the Kurdish SDF in northern Syria. The U.S. said that it's been extended till the end of the week. It looks like a major battle could be brewing here as Turkey is massing troops along the border. Turkish forces have been building up on the border area near Kobani in recent days and are now reported to be strategically positioned at several sites along the Syrian border. Turkey is said to want a 30-kilometer or 18.5-mile buffer zone across their entire southern border with Syria. And with help from its allies, the Syrian National Army, it may be close to achieving that goal. And then, of course, it might not stop there as well. Turkey might try to get more territory. U.S. officials are suggesting that a massive incursion is likely from Turkey and is probably imminent, judging by positioning of its troops. The target is presumably Syria's northeast, held by U.S.-backed Kurdish forces from the SDF. And this is no surprise here. Turkey has a strategic goal, they just said recently, of the elimination of the YPG, which is the largest body. It's basically the military wing of the SDF. And so, this is really just an area to keep an eye on that the U.S. is involved in. You got Turkey on one side, which is a NATO ally, but they consider these Kurds terrorists, a terrorist organization, an offshoot of the PKK or a wing of the PKK, which the U.S. also considers to be a terrorist group. U.S. officials have said that they basically renamed the YPG to the SDF because the YPG is known as Syria's wing of the PKK. So again, it just goes to show what a mess the U.S. policy in Syria is. All right, so the next one here, Julani meets with British diplomats, discusses removal from terror list. This article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. The leader of the al-Qaeda-linked Syria rebel group that removed Assad from power met with British officials to request the removal of sanctions and the terror designation of his group. So British officials have already met with Julani here. So he met with Stephen Hickey, the director of the Middle East Department at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and Anne Snow, the UK's envoy to Syria. And they met in Damascus. And according to statements given to Middle East Eye, officials from Julani's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham said the talks discussed the latest developments in Syria. The UK's foreign ministry stated the British officials discussed London's role in Damascus's transition of power from Assad. And Julani also gave an interview with the London Times, to press for sanctions relief. He said, quote, "Countries must now lift this designation. Syria is very important geostrategically. They should lift all restrictions which were imposed on the flogger and its victim. The flogger is now gone. This issue is not up for negotiation," end quote. So Julani, who fought for al-Qaeda in Iraq against American soldiers, added that the HTS's designation as a foreign terror organization is inappropriate. HTS has been labeled a terror group by Washington and London since 2017. When Julani created the group, at the time, both governments recognized that HTS was merely a rebranding of al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate al-Nusra, which Julani founded. And Julani, now both the U.S. and the U.K. are considering lifting the terrorist designation on Julani, as we've been talking about quite a bit. All right, so the next one here, controversy hits CNN over staged report on Syrian prisoner rescue. So this article is from The Cradle. So this was very funny, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. Clarissa Ward from CNN was in Damascus and did this report where they claim they just, they were at a prison in Damascus, and there was one prisoner left there, and they say that they shot the lock off. They turned the cameras off for that, and then they let him out, and he was saying, I haven't seen the sunlight in 3 months, and it was this big dramatic scene. He was hugging Clarissa Ward, and it seemed very fishy. It seemed very fishy. And essentially they said that this guy who gave them a name, saying that, he was a victim of the Assad regime. Well, it turns out he was actually a former intelligence official from the Assad government. So he was a corrupt official who was put in jail, before Damascus fell. And apparently he was in jail for less than a month. So CNN has admitted that there was an error in their report. And they mentioned the guy's real name. He was a first lieutenant in Syrian Air Force intelligence, notorious for his activities in Homs. Residents identified him as a frequently stationed at a checkpoint in the area's western entrance. So it's just very funny that, they have this whole report freeing this guy, saying he's a victim of the Assad regime. And it turns out he was an intelligence officer under Assad, who was jailed, again, before the regime change. So just very funny. And so there's a Syrian fact-checking organization, Verify Psy, that was the first one to say it was this guy. They cited locals who were saying that Salama, which is the guy's name, managed different security checkpoints across Homs and was involved in, quote, theft, extortion, and coercing residents into becoming informants, end quote. According to these sources, he had recently been detained due to his involvement in extortion. So a corrupt former intelligence officer is who Clarissa Ward dramatically freed from jail. All right, so the next one here, Ukraine kills Russian general in Moscow bombing. So a senior Russian general was killed by a bomb blast in Moscow on Tuesday in a targeted killing Ukrainian sources say was carried out by the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU. So this is Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov. He was the head of Russia's radiological, chemical, and biological defense forces and was killed alongside his assistant, Igor Kirill, outside of a residential building. Russian investigators say an explosive device was planted on a nearby scooter. So you see the aftermath of the blast here, and the bodies are under those, they're covered up. An SBU source told BBC that Kirillov was a legitimate target, saying that he was responsible for war crimes and chemical weapons attacks. Allegation that Russia denies. The Russian military says that Kirillov was responsible for protecting Russian forces from nuclear, chemical, and biological attacks. The British government expressed support for the assassination. A spokesman for British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said, quote, "We're not going to mourn the death of an individual who's propagated an illegal invasion and imposed suffering and death on the Ukrainian people," end quote. I mean, you talk about the precedents that are being set here. Imagine an American general was killed in a bombing in D.C. for his role in, wars in the Middle East. I mean, how would the West react to that? So Russian officials are vowing a response to the assassination and plan to raise the issue at the UN Security Council. So what's important for us, for me as an American, very important context here, is that the US, the CIA, really helped build up the SBU to the intelligence, force that it is today, that it's able to conduct these assassinations deep inside Russia. And last year, there was a big report from the Washington Post that credited the SBU and Ukraine's military intelligence's ability to carry out targeted killings inside Russia. They credited CIA support for them. I just worded that kind of poorly, but what I'm saying is that report said it's thanks to all this support that the CIA gave them that they're able to conduct these assassinations behind enemy lines. And the one that they pointed to was the August 2022 assassination of Daria Dugina, who's the daughter of Alexander Dugin, a Russian philosopher. She was a civilian. And the Post report said that her killing in similar assassinations, quote, involved elite teams of Ukrainian operatives drawn from directorates that were formed, trained, and equipped in close partnership with the CIA, end quote. The CIA spent tens of millions of dollars on the effort and helped form a new unit of the SBU known as the 5th Directorate that was created specifically to develop groups capable of operating behind front lines and working covertly. So this report also detailed how the CIA helped build up Ukraine's military intelligence, which one former U.S. intelligence official referred to as our little baby. And that's the Ukrainian Military Intelligence Directorate, known as the GUR or HUR. So, we don't know if the U.S. was actually, or the CIA was actually involved in this bombing. Can't say anything like that for sure. But what we do know is that the CIA has really helped create this assassination, this intelligence, these intelligence services that can conduct assassinations like this. They played a very big role in helping build them up. All right, so the last story here, Uhuru members will face no prison time. So a district judge ruled on Monday that 3 members of the Florida-based Uhuru movement will face probation but no jail time for being found guilty of conspiring to act as foreign agents of Russia, a conviction that came as a result of the group being targeted by the federal government for their political views. So Amali Yeshitela, he's the founder of the African People's Socialist Party and Uhuru movement, which is abbreviated APSP, and 2 other members of the group known as the Uhuru 3 were indicted by the U.S. Justice Department over their contacts with a Russian NGO known as the Anti-Globalization Movement of Russia. So I should have followed this case more closely. I covered it last year when they were first indicted, and then the ruling in September. But so essentially, this is a group. They're like a black liberation group. They've been around a long time. And the accusation is that this anti-globalization movement of Russia, which is an NGO, was recruiting Americans to spread Russian propaganda on behalf of Russian intelligence and interfere in elections and things. And it was essentially just because they had contact with this group that these people were targeted. And the DOJ targeted these 3, known as the Uhuru 3, by using the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA, claiming that they failed to register under the law while acting as agents of the Russian government. And again, their evidence for that is just talking to people from Russia and having political views that they don't like, having a view of the war in Ukraine that the U.S. doesn't like. Yeshitela and the other members denied that they were acting as Russian agents and said that it was clear they were being targeted for their political speech. The APSP has denounced U.S. involvement in Ukraine and expressed support for Russia, but the group has spoken out against U.S. foreign policy since it was founded in 1972. It also has a long history of working with other groups around the world. In September, a judge ruled that the Uhuru 3 were not guilty of failing to register as foreign agents, but found them guilty of conspiring to act. So it's confusing. They were not guilty of failing to register as foreign agents, but they were found guilty of conspiring to act as foreign agents without notifying the Attorney General, which doesn't make much sense here. So prosecutors were still seeking prison time for the Uhuru 3, but the district judge that sentenced them said there would be no prison time and sentenced them to 3 years of probation and 300 hours of community service, which they shouldn't be sentenced to anything. They're going to appeal the conviction. But the judge, sided more with them than the federal government in the things that he said. He said, quote, "If not for the requirement to register as a foreign agent, everything in the indictment would be legal and protected speech," end quote. So under FARA laws, the Uhuru 3 could have faced up to 5 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. Yeshitela told a crowd of supporters outside the courthouse, quote, "If you listen to what the judge had to say, he said what our lawyers have been saying all along. Our lawyers have said that we shouldn't be here. Our lawyers have said that even if this thing goes to trial, it's an assault, a major assault on the First Amendment," end quote. And it certainly is that. And this is an important case because there might be a precedent set here. And they could go after other groups, organizations, just for speaking with people in other countries. They're going to appeal the conviction and say they're going to work against the foreign agent laws, kind of launch a campaign for the repeal of these FARA laws, which again are used selectively. The fact that AIPAC doesn't have to register under FARA is a joke. The law should be done away with. It's a similar law that the U.S. freaked out about Georgia adopting, and here we see it weaponized against this group. All right, so that is it for the news for today. One thing I want to talk about, I've been meaning to mention, is the drone sightings over the U.S. Everybody has their theories about what's happening, and then you have the U.S. government saying, essentially, the line is, we don't know what they are, but it's not a threat. Don't worry about it, which is very suspicious. I think if it was a foreign, if there was foreign involvement, I think that the U.S. government would be capitalizing on that much more, kind of stoking the fear to get some legislation passed or something. We've seen some members of Congress say like, oh, Iran's involved or something, but that hasn't really gone anywhere. But at the same time, we see the federal government saying, oh, we need more funding for things like this. So they're certainly going to use it, whatever it is, to get more spending passed for certain things. It could be a test of some sort of new drone that they want to test over population centers. People are spotting them over New Jersey. For a little while, I thought it was kind of I thought it was kind of maybe fake. It was a hysteria, but I'm from New York, and people I used to work with up there that live in Jersey, Long Island, have seen a lot of these drones. Just recently, I live in Virginia. A friend of mine near Richmond, who's north of me, said he's just seen a bunch of drones tonight. So it's very strange, whatever it is. So it's something, we're going to kind of keep an eye on. But again, there's all these theories. There's the theory that they're trying to detect some kind of radioactive material. I really don't know what to make of it, but it's something's happening here. So, I'll try to follow it a little more closely because it certainly is related to what we do here at antiwar.com. But that is it for me. Actually, I didn't mention the viewpoints. We have one from Ted Galen Carpenter, Washington's long flirtation with Syria's extreme Islamists. One from Michael Clare, can Trump China or vice versa? One from Anatole Levin, European peacekeepers in Ukraine, a horrible idea. One from John Weeks, exposing truth through history and fiction. One from Brandon Buck, U.S. veterans say, didn't we fight Al-Qaeda terrorists for a reason? Please go check all of that out. One thing I did today, I started a TikTok page for antiwar.com. I figured TikTok was going to be banned soon, so we might as well get over there. I just posted a clip of this show. I think we have like 5 followers, but if you're on TikTok, go follow us. I never really used TikTok before, but anyway, go follow us over there. We'll see what happens with that. Follow us on Instagram and on X as well. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.